Before we begin, I want to give you a fair warning. This story delves into intense emotional conflicts, hidden desires, and the consequences of betrayal. It explores themes of love, dissatisfaction, temptation, and the choices that can change everything. If these topics make you uncomfortable, now might be the time to step away. It's strange how love changes. People tell you relationships evolve, that the fire dies down but something deeper takes its place. Something steady, something safe. And for a long time I believed that. I told myself that passion was just a phase, that it wasn't supposed to last. But deep down I knew that was a lie. I was 24 when I met Nathan. He was everything I thought I wanted: charming, responsible, the kind of man who never left you guessing where you stood. He planned things. He was reliable. A man with a 5-year plan, a 10-year vision. A man who talked about mortgages and retirement funds and what school our future kids would go to. At first, that stability felt like everything. I had spent my early 20s dating men who burned bright but fizzled out just as fast. Guys who made my heart race but left me feeling unsteady, unsure. Nathan was different. He was solid, a rock I could lean on. And for a while I thought that was enough. But now, 6 years later, I don't know. I wake up next to him every morning, but it feels like we haven't really seen each other in years. We kiss, but it's out of habit. We have sex, but it's just going through the motions. I try to remind myself that love isn't always supposed to be thrilling, that comfort is more important than passion. But lately I've started wondering, what if that's not true? What if I don't just miss passion? What if I need it? I think about it all the time now. The feeling of being wanted. Not just loved but craved. I want to be desired so badly it drives someone insane. I want to be kissed with impatience, held with greed. I want to feel a man's hands grip my waist like he can't help himself. But Nathan isn't that kind of man. And maybe he never was. I try not to resent him for it. He works hard. He provides. He's a good man, and I know he loves me in his own way. But when I look at him, when I think about the life we've built, all I feel is a growing emptiness. It wasn't always like this. I remember a time when just the sound of his voice was enough to make my skin tingle. When he'd pull me into his lap just to feel my weight against him. When I'd wake up to find his hands on my hips, his lips at my neck. But now he kisses my forehead before bed and turns over. Now when we touch, it's carefully controlled, like he's checking a box instead of wanting me. Now I feel like a stranger in my own body. And I can't take it any longer. I don't want to be the woman who cheats. I don't want to be the woman who ruins a good thing just because she's restless. But I also don't want to be the woman who spends the rest of her life pretending this is enough. That night I felt it heavier than ever. Nathan had already gone to bed. Like always, I was alone in the kitchen, drinking wine straight from the bottle, staring at the empty counter like it held all the answers. The silence in the house was unbearable. I reached for my phone before I could stop myself. I needed someone to talk to. Someone who understood. I scrolled through my contacts and stopped on one name: Bria. I called her without thinking. She picked up after the third ring. "Elle," she said, her voice groggy. "Do you know what time it is? Tell me I'm crazy." I whispered, my fingers tightening around the wine bottle. She sighed. "Depends. Crazy for what?" "For wanting more." There was a long pause. I could picture her sitting up in bed, rubbing her eyes, trying to find the right words. Bria was always careful with me. She never judged. She just listened. "Elle," she said finally, "you're not crazy. You're just starved." That word hit me like a punch to the gut. Starved. She was right. I wasn't just bored. I wasn't just restless. I was starving. Starving for something deeper. Something raw. Something that made my breath hitch and my pulse race. "What am I supposed to do?" I asked. "Just live like this? Pretend it's fine?" Bria sighed again. "No," she said. "You need to figure out what you want. And when you do, you need to stop being afraid of it." Her words sent a chill through me. Because the truth was, I already knew what I wanted. I just didn't know if I was ready to admit it. I hung up and sat there in the dim glow of the kitchen. The wine warming my throat, my heartbeat loud in my ears. Something had to change. And soon it would. If you're still with me, don't forget to like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more stories like this. Trust me, there's so much more to uncover. I didn't think much of it when Nathan told me his cousin Jake would be staying with us for a while. It's just temporary, he said over dinner one night, barely looking up from his phone. He's in between jobs. Needs a place to crash. I just nodded. Nathan had a big family, and over the years I'd met most of them at reunions and weddings. But I barely remembered Jake. How old is he now? I asked, poking at my food. 23, I think. He was a kid the last time I saw him. Quiet. Always had his nose in a book. Quiet. Shy. Not the type of man who would normally catch my attention. So when he finally showed up at our doorstep a week later, bag slung over his shoulder, I barely glanced at him. This is Jake, Nathan said, patting his cousin on the back. You guys probably don't remember each other, but he's family. Hey, I said casually, offering a small smile. Hi, Jake replied, barely meeting my eyes. I took him in, tall, lean, but not in an intimidating way. His posture was slightly hunched, his hands tucked into his pockets like he wanted to take up as little space as possible. His dark hair was a little too long, falling into his eyes. He was attractive, certainly, but in an understated way. Not the type of man who knew how to own a room. If anything, he seemed like the kind of guy who avoided being noticed altogether. I didn't think twice about him. At least not at first. The kind of guy who avoids being noticed altogether. I didn't think twice about him, at least not at first. Jake mostly kept to himself. He spent his days in the guest room, job hunting on his laptop, his door always half closed. At dinner he barely spoke, answering questions with a shrug or a quiet, "Yeah, I guess." Nathan and I didn't talk much either, so the house was just silent. But then one night everything changed. It was late. Nathan had fallen asleep hours ago. His back turned to me like always. I had been tossing and turning, restless, my mind running in circles. I got up to grab some water. As I walked past the guest room, I noticed the door cracked open just an inch, just enough to see inside. And that's when I saw him. Jake was sitting at his desk, hunched over his laptop, headphones in. His hand was buried between his legs, his body tense. First, I almost looked away, but then I saw what was on his screen. It wasn't soft. It wasn't gentle. The woman on the screen was being handled roughly, pinned down, held in place. Her face flushed with a mix of pleasure and submission. The man above her didn't ask for permission. He took. I felt something hot coil in my stomach. Jake shifted in his chair, gripping himself tighter, his breathing ragged, his face set in deep concentration. I shouldn't have been watching. I should have walked away. But I didn't. I stood there, hidden in the shadows, my pulse hammering in my ears. Because for the first time since he arrived, I didn't see the quiet, awkward boy Nathan had described. I saw something else. Something buried. A fire waiting to be lit. The next morning, I pretended nothing had happened. At breakfast, Jake kept his head down, spooning cereal into his mouth, silent. I knew exactly what I was going to do. Over the next few days I started testing him. Little things at first. I'd brush past him in the kitchen, just close enough that my hand grazed his back. I'd lean over him to grab something from a high shelf, my body pressing just slightly against him. I'd hold eye contact a second too long. I watched him carefully. First he barely reacted. But then one night I caught him looking at me. I was in the living room, wearing nothing but one of Nathan's old t-shirts. Jake was on the couch pretending to watch TV. But I felt his eyes on my legs. I didn't acknowledge it. I just stretched, arching my back, letting the shirt ride up ever so slightly. When I flipped over, his face was red. He swallowed hard, looking away. I smiled to myself. This was going to be fun. At dinner I turned up the heat. "So Jake," I said casually, twirling my fork between my fingers, "got a girlfriend?" His eyes brightened. He folded at Nathan, then back at me. No. Not really. Not really." I tilted my head. "So there's someone?" "No, I just..." He shifted uncomfortably. "I don't date much." "Why not?" Nathan chuckled. "He's shy. Always has been." Jake's jaw clenched. "I'm not shy." "Oh." I leaned forward, resting my chin on my hand. "Then what are you?" He didn't answer. But I saw the way his fingers curled into a fist under the table. The way his throat bobbed as he swallowed. I smiled. Because Jake was starting to question himself. And that's exactly what I wanted. Started as a game. I told myself that at first, that I was just teasing, just playing. That there was no harm in a little curiosity. But curiosity has a way of unraveling everything. Jake had been living with us for a few weeks, and in that time I had learned something about him, something no one else seemed to notice. He wasn't just quiet. He was holding himself back. First I thought it was just shyness, but it was more than that. He had this way of making himself smaller, like he didn't want to take up space. He avoided confrontation, kept his voice low, never pushed back. I wondered if anyone had ever told him he didn't have to be that way. So I decided to test him, to see what he was hiding underneath. Started with small things. Nothing obvious. Nothing he could call out. Just subtle shifts. A light touch on his arm that lasted a second too long. A glance held for just a moment longer than necessary. A whisper when I could have spoken normally. Little by little I watched him react. At first it was barely noticeable. The way his fingers curled when I got close, the way he hesitated before answering me. But then one night I saw something more. It was late. Nathan had gone to bed hours ago. Like always, I had been lying awake, restless, staring at the ceiling. I got up to get some air. That's when I noticed Jake on the back porch, sitting alone, his shoulders hunched as he stared into the night. I stepped outside, wrapping my arms around myself against the cool air. "Can't sleep?" I asked. He looked up, startled for a second before shaking his head. "Guess not." I sat down next to him on the porch steps, letting the silence settle between us. The night was quiet, except for the distant hum of cars and the rustling of leaves in the wind. After a while I said, "Do you ever feel unseen?" Jake exhaled through his nose, staring straight ahead. "Yeah." I turned my head slightly, watching his profile. "Yeah." His jaw tensed. "My whole life, pretty much." His voice was quiet, but there was something behind it. Something unspoken. I studied him for a moment, then said, "That's a shame." He finally looked at me. "Why?" I held his gaze. "Because you deserve to be noticed." Something shifted in the air between us. For a moment neither of us moved. Then slowly he reached out and touched my wrist. It wasn't much, just his fingers brushing against my skin. But for Jake it was everything. His voice was lower when he spoke again. "You think so?" I nodded, feeling the weight of the moment settle between us. Because for the first time, he wasn't holding back. And I had a feeling he never would again. Everything. Because for the first time in weeks I was the one left breathless. I thought I could stop. I told myself it was just a moment, a slip, a fleeting thing, nothing permanent. But moments like that don't just disappear. They dig into you, stay under your skin. And no matter how hard you try to ignore them, they change you. That night with Jake, it wasn't just a shift in him, it was a shift in me. And suddenly I wasn't sure who I was anymore. Nathan came home 2 days later. He kissed me when he walked through the door, the same way he always did. A quick peck on the cheek, more habit than passion. "Miss me?" he asked, tossing his keys on the counter. I forced a smile. Of course. He didn't notice the way my hands were shaking. Or maybe he just didn't care enough to look. I spent the next few days trying to pretend everything was normal. That I wasn't different, that I wasn't restless. But I could feel the change inside me. Coiling in my stomach, pressing against my ribs. I craved something now, something raw, something real. And I didn't know how to make it go away. Jake, on the other hand, had never seemed more at ease. He wasn't the quiet, uncertain man I had met weeks ago. He moved differently now, more confidently, more assured. He didn't shrink back anymore. He didn't avoid my eyes. He knew. And I did too. Briley noticed before Nathan did. We were having coffee at a little cafe downtown. The late afternoon sun casting long shadows over the table. I had barely touched my drink, my hands wouldn't stop fidgeting. "All right, spill," she said, stirring her iced latte with a straw. "Something's up with you." I forced a laugh. "Nothing's up." She raised an eyebrow. I exhaled slowly, my stomach twisting. "I made a mistake," I admitted. Her eyes narrowed. "What kind of mistake?" I hesitated because saying it out loud would make it real. "Jake," I finally said. She went still. Then, "No. Absolutely not." I swallowed hard. "It's not what you think." "Really? Because it sounds like you're playing with fire." I shook my head. It's not serious. I can stop anytime. Briley stared at me for a long moment. Then she groaned, leaning back in her chair. That's what they all say. I wanted to argue. I wanted to tell her that I had control, that it was just a phase, a passing urge. But deep down I knew she was right, because I didn't want to stop. And that terrified me. Nathan started noticing the changes in me. Not right away, but slowly over time. He'd catch me staring off into space, my thoughts somewhere else. You okay? He asked one night, his brow furrowed. Yeah, I lied, forcing a smile. But I knew he didn't believe me. Because for the first time in our entire relationship, I wasn't pretending very well. And I didn't know how much longer I could keep the truth buried. Jake was different now. Not just with me, but with everything. He wasn't afraid to take up space anymore. He spoke with confidence. He held eye contact without wavering. I saw the way he carried himself around Nathan now. Not timid, not hesitant, but equal. Like he wasn't the kid cousin who needed help anymore. Like he was a man who knew exactly what he wanted. And I was starting to realize something terrifying. Maybe Nathan was never what I needed. Maybe Jake was. Guilt has a way of creeping in no matter how much you try to ignore it. I told myself that what was happening with Jake was just temporary. That it was something I could stop whenever I wanted. That I was still in control. But the truth? The truth was that control had slipped through my fingers the moment I let him change me. And now everything was unraveling. Because Nathan wasn't blind. He was starting to notice. And he wasn't the type of man to let things go unnoticed for long. It started with little things. A glance too sharp. A silence that lingered too long. The way he would watch me from across the room. Eyes narrowed, as if trying to solve a puzzle he didn't even know existed yet. You've been different, he said one evening, his voice calm but firm. I froze. Different how? He shrugged, setting down his glass. I don't know. Just off. Distracted. My pulse quickened, but I forced a smile. It's nothing. He studied me for a moment, then nodded, though I could tell he didn't believe me. And in that moment, I knew the suspicion had already taken root. It was only a matter of time before it grew into something more. That night I should have been careful. I should have kept my distance. But I didn't. Because no matter how hard I tried to pull away from Jake, I kept coming back. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about me. The person I became around him. The fire he had ignited inside me. And I wasn't ready to let that go. We met in the backyard just past midnight. The air was thick, the silence pressing against my skin like a warning. This is getting dangerous, I murmured, my voice barely above a whisper. Jake's expression was unreadable. Do you want to stop? I opened my mouth, then closed it, because I didn't have an answer. Or maybe I just didn't want to say it out loud. Jake exhaled, running a hand through his hair. Then don't lie to yourself. His words cut through me. Because he was right. I wasn't lying to Nathan. I was lying to myself. And I hated that I didn't want to stop. When I walked back inside, Nathan was standing in the kitchen. The second I saw him, my stomach dropped. Because his face, his posture, his energy was different. Colder. Sharper. Like he had just seen something he wasn't supposed to see. I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly dry. You're still up. He didn't answer right away. Just looked at me. Looked through me. Then, in a quieter voice than I expected, he said, Who were you with? My heart nearly stopped. What? Outside. He clarified, his tone clipped. Who were you talking to? I had two choices in that moment. I could lie. Or I could finally tell the truth. I opened my mouth, ready to spin some excuse, some half-truth, something to get me out of this. But then Nathan pulled out his phone. And everything fell apart.